Ethan Calloway never thought he'd be the kind of man to check his wife's phone. But when he found himself alone in their bedroom, his fingers hesitated over Olivia's screen, heart pounding like a war drum. The past few months had been filled with unanswered questions, late nights, hushed phone calls, the scent of unfamiliar cologne on her scarves. The distance between them had stretched taut, turning their once effortless conversations into strained exchanges. And then he saw it. Message. A name he didn't recognize. Last night was incredible. I can't stop thinking about you. Ethan felt the room tilt. His breath came in short gasps as if the walls were closing in. His wife, the woman he'd built a life with, the mother of their daughter, was having an affair. For days, he said nothing. He became an observer in his own marriage, watching Olivia with new eyes. He noticed the way she smiled at her phone, the way she hesitated before answering calls, the way she seemed present yet distant, like a ghost in their home. His mind churned with questions. Who was this man? How long had this been going on? And, the worst question of all, why? Instead of confronting her outright, Ethan sought out an old friend, Daniel Reed, a private investigator. Daniel's approach was methodical. Within a week, Ethan had pictures, hotel receipts, even an alias, Christopher Hale. The evidence was damning. Yet, the more he learned, the less he understood. Olivia wasn't reckless. She wasn't someone who would throw away their life for a fling. There had to be something deeper, something he was missing. One evening, after tucking their daughter into bed, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, hands clenched into fists. "Who is Christopher Hale?" he asked, his voice eerily calm. Olivia froze. The color drained from her face, and for a long moment she said nothing. Then, instead of denial, her lips trembled and she let out a shaky breath. "Ethan!" "What?" His voice cracked. "Tell me the truth. How long?" She swallowed hard, staring at her wedding ring. Almost a year. A year. It hit him like a freight train. His mind reeled. Holidays, anniversaries, nights spent waiting for her, believing she was working late. He laughed, but there was no humor in it. "And you were just going to keep lying?" "I was going to end it." He scoffed. "Sure, that's convenient." Tears welled in her eyes. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" His voice rose. "Make me understand." She exhaled, rubbing her temples as though trying to piece together something even she didn't fully grasp. "It wasn't about sex," she whispered. "It was about feeling like I mattered." The words sliced through him. "So I didn't make you feel that way?" "It's not that simple." He shook his head. "No, Liv, it is. You made a choice, and now—" He pushed back from the table, unable to finish the sentence. The days that followed were a blur of avoidance and painful silences. Olivia stayed at her sister's for a while, giving them both space. But the truth was, space didn't bring clarity. It only deepened the questions. He didn't just hate what she'd done. He hated that part of him still wanted to understand, still wanted to reach for the life they'd built. Then, another revelation came, one Daniel uncovered. Christopher Hale wasn't just some affair. He was a con man, involved in fraudulent business deals. Olivia, knowingly or not, had been tangled in something dangerous. Ethan felt a new kind of betrayal, one not just rooted in love, but in trust. Had she put their family in danger? When she finally returned, they sat on opposite ends of the couch, the weight of everything between them. "I need to know everything," he said. "Not just the affair. Everything." She hesitated, then nodded. "I met him at a charity event. He made me feel seen. I never meant for it to turn into this. But when I found out what he was involved in, I tried to cut ties. That's when he started threatening me." Ethan clenched his jaw. Threatening you? She nodded. If I told anyone about his scams, he'd ruin me. He said he'd make sure you lost your job, that our daughter would grow up resenting me. A fresh wave of anger surged through him. Why didn't you come to me? Tears spilled down her cheeks. Because I knew I'd already destroyed us. Silence stretched between them, heavy with all that had been lost. He wanted to scream, to demand why she hadn't trusted him enough to stand by her, to fix things together. But part of him understood. She had been drowning in her own mistakes, and he hadn't even noticed. The question remained. Was there anything left to salvage? In the weeks that followed, they worked through the wreckage, piece by jagged piece. Trust was not easily rebuilt, and some wounds refused to fully heal. Christopher Hale was arrested, but that didn't erase the damage. Olivia faced consequences, both legal and personal. Ethan wrestled with whether forgiveness was even possible. Their daughter, oblivious to the depth of their struggles, days turned into weeks, and the uneasy truce between Ethan and Olivia continued. They functioned as co-parents, maintaining an air of normalcy for their daughter, but beneath the surface, everything felt fragile, like a house of cards waiting for the slightest gust to bring it all down. One evening, Ethan met Daniel at a bar downtown, hoping a familiar face might help him make sense of things. You still haven't decided? Daniel asked, nursing his beer. Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face. I keep thinking about what's worse, staying, and never trusting her again, or leaving and wondering if I gave up too soon. Daniel took a slow sip, considering. Some people would say cheating is a deal-breaker. Ethan gave a bitter chuckle. Yeah, and some people would say love is worth fighting for. He shook his head. I don't even know if I still love her. I look at her, and all I see is the betrayal. Daniel studied him for a moment before leaning in. Then maybe the better question is, do you even want to love her again? Ethan had no answer. Back home, Olivia sat in the living room, staring at the pile of paperwork on the coffee table. Bank statements, emails, correspondence from the district attorney's office. Christopher Hale had been indicted on multiple fraud charges, and though Olivia had cooperated with the investigation, she was still tangled in the legal mess. Some of their mutual assets were frozen, and her name was being whispered in business circles as a woman who had been either a willing accomplice or a gullible fool. When Ethan walked in, she straightened. There's something I need to tell. You? He tensed. What now? I met with a lawyer today, she said, forcing herself to meet his gaze. They think I might have to testify at Christopher's trial. Ethan's jaw clenched. And that means what, exactly? It means this isn't over, she admitted. Even if we want to move forward, I'll be dragged through this for months, maybe years. Ethan ran a hand over his face, sighing. Jesus, Olivia, I know, she whispered. But I want you to know, I'm not fighting this alone. I won't hide things from you anymore. For the first time in a long time, he believed her. But belief wasn't the same as forgiveness. One evening, after putting their daughter to bed, Ethan found himself outside Olivia's door. He hesitated before knocking lightly. She opened it, surprised. What is it? He studied her for a long moment. I want to try therapy, together. Her breath hitched. You do? He nodded slowly. I don't know if it'll change anything, but I don't want to make a decision based on anger. Olivia swallowed hard. Okay. As she nodded, hope flickered in her expression, but Ethan wasn't ready to meet it with his own. He was offering a chance, nothing more, nothing less. For now, they would navigate the wreckage together. Whether they could rebuild from it was still a question without an answer. The first therapy session was brutal. Ethan sat stiffly on one end of the couch, arms crossed, jaw tight. Olivia, sitting beside him but feeling miles away, clenched her hands in her lap. The therapist, Dr. Marissa Clark, observed them both with a calm, measured gaze before speaking. "Why are you here?" Ethan exhaled sharply. "Because I don't want to make a mistake. Whether that mistake is leaving or staying, I don't know yet." Olivia turned to him, pain flickering in her eyes. "I'm here because I still love my husband," she said, voice steady. "Because I want to fight for our marriage if there's even the slightest chance." Dr. Clark nodded. "Then let's start with the hardest part. Ethan, what is it?" "You need to hear from Olivia that you haven't yet?" Ethan scoffed, shaking his head. "Where do I even start?" His voice hardened. "I need to know why, and I need to believe that she's telling me the whole truth." Olivia's throat tightened. "I've told you everything." "No," he bit out. "You've told me what you think I can handle." The room fell into a heavy silence. Dr. Clark leaned forward slightly. "Olivia, if there's anything you're still holding back, now is the time." Olivia swallowed. "It was never about you not being enough," she whispered. "I was drowning, Ethan. You were so caught up in work, in providing for us, in being strong all the time. I didn't know how to tell you I was falling apart." His fists clenched. "So instead of telling me, you turned to someone else?" "I tried," she pleaded. "But every time I did, you brushed it off. You told me to be patient, that things would get better." Ethan stared at her, his expression unreadable. Dr. Clark intervened. "Ethan, do you recognize that there may have been emotional disconnection before Olivia's actions?" His jaw tightened, but he nodded slightly. "Maybe," he admitted. "But that doesn't excuse what she did." "No, it doesn't," Dr. Clark agreed. "But it might help you understand the foundation of what happened. Affairs don't happen in a vacuum." Ethan leaned forward, pressing his palms together. "Then what the hell do we do now?" Dr. Clark offered a small smile. "That depends. Do you want to rebuild the marriage, or do you want closure so you can move on separately?" Ethan's eyes met Olivia's. There was pain, distrust, but also something else. Confusion, uncertainty. "I don't know yet," he admitted. And for now, that was the only answer he could give. The following weeks were a careful dance of progress and setbacks. Some sessions brought moments of clarity, while others left Ethan raw with anger. Olivia remained patient, understanding that she had no right to rush his healing. But healing wasn't linear. Some nights, Ethan would sit at the dinner table, staring at her as if trying to decide if she was the woman he had loved or a stranger he no longer recognized. Other nights, he found himself missing the simple things, the way she laughed, the way she curled up on the couch with a book. The hardest part was trust. One night, as Olivia was getting ready for bed, Ethan stood in the doorway. "I need to ask you something," he said. She turned, surprised. "Okay." "Are you still in love with him?" His voice was quiet but firm. Her eyes widened. "Ethan, tell me the truth. If you hesitate, I'll know." She swallowed hard. "No," she said, shaking her head. "I was never in love with him. I thought I needed him. But I was wrong." Ethan studied her, searching for any sign of a lie. He found none. "Okay," he said finally. That night, for the first time in months, he didn't sleep in the guest room. He didn't touch her, didn't say a word, but he lay beside her, listening to her breathe. It wasn't forgiveness, but maybe it was a start. 3 months later. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting soft shadows across the bedroom. Ethan stirred, rolling onto his side to find Olivia already awake, watching him carefully. It was the first morning in a long time that waking up beside her didn't feel strange. "Morning," she said softly. He held her gaze for a moment before nodding. "Morning." There was something different in the air, an ease that had been absent for months. They still weren't whole, but the jagged edges of their past were no longer as sharp. Ethan sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep?" Olivia admitted. Christopher's trial starts today. Ethan nodded. The weight of that truth hung between them. The man she had nearly ruined her life for, the man she had betrayed their marriage with, was about to face the consequences of his crimes. Olivia had spent months cooperating with the investigation, proving she had been a pawn in his schemes rather than an accomplice. "Are you ready?" he asked. She exhaled. "I don't know." Ethan watched her carefully, noting the tension in her posture. She had been trying so hard to prove herself to him, to be transparent, to be honest, to fight for their marriage. And slowly, piece by piece, she was earning back something that resembled trust. "Do you want me to be there?" he asked. Her eyes widened slightly, as if she hadn't expected the offer. "Yes," she said almost too quickly, "but only if you want to." Ethan hesitated. He wasn't sure what he wanted, but he knew this. Olivia had made her choices, and now he had to make his. "I'll be there," he said. A look of gratitude flickered across her face. Maybe this was what rebuilding looked like. The trial. The courtroom was sterile and cold, the air thick with tension. Olivia sat beside her lawyer, shoulders squared, head held high. Ethan sat a few rows back, watching. Christopher Hale was led inside, handcuffed, looking significantly worse than the last time Ethan had seen him. The arrogance that had once defined him had been stripped away, replaced by something hollow. The prosecutor presented evidence: fraud, embezzlement, illegal investments. Olivia's name came up, but only as someone he had manipulated. She had been cleared of legal wrongdoing, but the damage to her reputation remained. Then came Olivia's testimony. Ethan listened as she spoke about how Christopher had slowly drawn her in, made her feel like she was indispensable, convinced. She was special. She spoke about the affair, about the shame, about the lies she had told herself. And for the first time, Ethan saw it all laid bare, not as an excuse, but as the painful truth of someone who had been lost. She had made mistakes, but she wasn't that person anymore. Christopher smirked at her from across the room, but Olivia didn't flinch. Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Pride. She was standing in the wreckage of her choices, and she wasn't running. Maybe. Just maybe. That meant something. The aftermath. That night, back home, Olivia sat on the edge of the bed, exhaustion evident in her face. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her. "You did good today," he said. She looked up, surprised. "You think so?" He nodded. "Yeah, I do." A silence settled between them, a comfortable one. And then Olivia spoke, voice small. "Do you think we'll ever be okay again?" Ethan considered the question carefully. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I know we're better than we were yesterday." She exhaled slowly, then nodded, and that was enough. For now. 2 years later, Ethan sat on the back porch, a glass of whiskey in hand, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The sky burned with streaks of orange and violet, a fleeting beauty that would soon give way to darkness. Beside him, Olivia was curled up in a chair, reading a book. She didn't look at him, but he knew she was aware of his gaze. Life had settled into something resembling normalcy, the kind of normalcy that wasn't perfect, but was steady. Trust wasn't something that had simply reappeared between them. It had been rebuilt, brick by fragile brick, through long conversations, quiet reassurances, and time. So much time. Christopher Hale had faded into the past, just another ghost in the gallery of mistakes. Ethan had stopped checking for updates about him. He had stopped needing to know if the man who nearly destroyed his marriage was suffering. That part of his life was over, and yet, sometimes late at night, he still felt the phantom pain of betrayal. It wasn't as sharp anymore, but it was there. Maybe it always would be. "You're staring?" Olivia said, her voice soft. Ethan took a slow sip of his drink. I know. She finally looked at him, setting the book down. What are you thinking about? He considered lying, telling her it was nothing. But that's what their old life had been built on. Silence, avoidance, half-truths. So he told her the truth. Us, he said. How far we've come. How much further we have to go. Her lips pressed together, and for a moment he thought he saw fear in her eyes. Fear that he was still uncertain, that he might one day wake up and decide that trying wasn't enough. But he reached for her hand, threading his fingers through hers, and she exhaled. We're still here, she said. Yeah, he murmured. We are. Neither of them said it out loud, but they both understood. Staying was a choice. Every day they chose this. And maybe that was what love really was, not just passion, not just history, but choosing each other despite the cracks, despite the scars. Maybe that was enough, for now, for always. The end. 3 years later. The morning was quiet, the kind of silence that came with familiarity rather than tension. Ethan sat at the kitchen table, coffee in hand, scrolling through the news on his phone. Olivia moved around the kitchen absent-mindedly, stirring a pot of oatmeal on the stove. They had fallen into a rhythm, one that felt natural even if it wasn't effortless. Ethan had expected things to break apart completely after the betrayal. Even after deciding to stay, he had wondered if they were only delaying the inevitable. But time had a way of softening edges, of allowing space for something new to grow where trust had once been shattered. Did you see the email from the real estate agent? Olivia asked, turning to face him. He nodded. Yeah, they said the offer was accepted. Her eyes lit up, a small smile tugging at her lips. So, we're really doing this? Ethan let out a breath, nodding. We are. The idea of a fresh start had been lingering between them for over a year now. Moving to a new home, leaving, behind the place where so many of their worst moments had unfolded. It wasn't about running away. It was about stepping into something different. Olivia set down the wooden spoon and leaned against the counter, studying him. Are you sure? He met her gaze. Yeah, I think I am. She walked over, placing a tentative hand on his shoulder. Once, that touch would have made him flinch, memories of betrayal flooding in. Now it just felt warm, not perfect, but good. We've come a long way, she murmured. Ethan reached up, covering her hand with his own. Yeah, we have. Their marriage wasn't what it used to be. It never would be. But maybe that was okay. Maybe what they had now, imperfect, honest, constantly evolving, was better. As Olivia leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to his temple, Ethan closed his eyes. This was his choice, and for the first time in years, he wasn't second-guessing it. Epilogue. The new house was smaller, quieter, a single story with wide windows that let in the morning light. It wasn't grand, but it was theirs. On their first night there, Ethan and Olivia stood in the living room, surrounded by boxes. The air was filled with the scent of fresh paint and new beginnings. Olivia sighed, tucking her hair behind her ear. Feels strange, doesn't it? Ethan glanced around. A little. She reached for his hand, threading their fingers together. But good strange? He squeezed her hand, looking into her eyes, the same eyes that had once looked at him with guilt and shame, now filled with something quieter, steadier. Yeah, he said. Good strange. As they stood there in the middle of their new home, Ethan realized something. He wasn't waiting for the past to disappear anymore. He was just living. And that was enough. The end. Ethan sat by the window, staring out at the quiet street, his fingers lightly tapping the glass. The moon hung high, its pale light casting a silver sheen over everything. It had been months since Olivia returned home after the truth came to light. months of working through the tangled mess she'd created. There had been counseling, late-night conversations filled with apologies and revelations, but each word was wrapped in a layer of doubt. The questions still haunted him. Could he ever forgive her? Could he rebuild the life they once had? Or was it too far gone? He glanced over at the couch where Olivia sat, her face a mixture of exhaustion and uncertainty. She had tried so hard, and yet the scars of betrayal remained, etched deeply into their shared history. He had seen the raw vulnerability in her eyes, the fear of losing him, the guilt of what she'd done, but he wasn't sure if it was enough. "Do you ever think about leaving?" Olivia asked, her voice tentative, almost afraid of the answer. Ethan didn't answer immediately. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, the quiet tension that had been there since the day they started down this path. He had spent so much time lost in his own head, wondering if he could ever trust her again. But the truth was, he wasn't sure if he could trust himself either. Trust had been shattered in ways they both never expected. "Every day," he finally said, his voice low but steady. Olivia's eyes filled with pain, but she didn't look away. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I know I don't deserve to ask this, but could we try to fix this? For us?" Her words, so simple and yet so heavy, hung in the air like a plea for redemption. Ethan swallowed hard, running a hand through his hair. His mind screamed in different directions, torn between what he knew was right for him and the life he thought he wanted. Olivia was right in front of him, asking for another chance, and yet he couldn't escape the echo of betrayal. "Do you still love me?" he asked, his voice betraying a trace of vulnerability he hadn't allowed himself to feel before. She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "More than anything." Ethan closed his eyes briefly, his chest tightening with a mixture of grief and longing. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to return to the life they had, the love that once seemed invincible. But could he ever truly forget the lies? Could he ever stop seeing her in the light of her betrayal? "I don't know," he whispered, more to himself than to her. Olivia let out a quiet sob, but she didn't try to stop him. She had hurt him in ways that words could never heal, and now she had to let him find his own way through the darkness they'd both created. There was no easy answer. There was no perfect solution. But as they sat there, silent in the space between hope and regret, Ethan realized something. He wasn't ready to give up just yet. He needed time. He needed to figure out if the pieces of their life together could be put back in a way that was whole again. For now, they would exist in this limbo, uncertain but willing to try, because sometimes that was all you could do. Try. And maybe, just maybe, that was the beginning of something new. Weeks passed, each day blending into the next like the slow churn of time grinding down the sharp edges of their pain. Ethan and Olivia kept moving through the motions, morning coffee, shared glances, a tentative effort at normalcy, but the space between them remained vast, filled with unspoken questions and emotions neither of them dared to confront fully. Ethan had returned to work, but it wasn't the same. He couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted, that the foundation they had built their lives on was now cracked, and no matter how hard he tried to patch it, it would never be whole again. He spent his nights pacing the apartment, his mind wandering to places he didn't want to go. He thought of the man Olivia had been with, the lies she'd told, the danger she had unknowingly invited into their lives. But then, there were the moments that stopped him in his tracks, when Olivia would brush against him, her fingers grazing his arm as she passed by. A flash of the warmth they once shared, the intimacy that had seemed so effortless. It made him want to believe that they could heal, that this wasn't the end, that maybe, just maybe, there was something worth saving. But he wasn't sure if Olivia believed that anymore. One evening, when the air outside carried the first hints of autumn, Olivia spoke again. They had just finished dinner, and Ethan sat at the kitchen table, absent-mindedly scrolling through his phone. He heard the rustle of fabric and looked up to find her standing in the doorway, her eyes softer than he'd seen them in weeks. "I want to show you something," she said, her voice low, like she was about to reveal something fragile. Ethan set his phone down, curiosity piqued. "What is it?" She hesitated, then stepped into the room, holding out a small, worn notebook. "It's something I kept. I don't know why. Maybe I thought it would help me understand us." Ethan took the notebook, unsure of what to expect. He opened it, and the first page was filled with Olivia's handwriting, notes, thoughts, and reflections from their earlier years together. The pages were filled with memories of their early days of dating, their wedding, the birth of their daughter. But as he flipped through, he noticed something change. Darker thoughts creeping in, moments where she wrote about feeling distant, lost, and disconnected. "I never wanted you to see this," Olivia said quietly, her voice trembling. "I didn't know how to explain it, how lost I felt. But it wasn't just about the affair, Ethan. It's everything." Ethan's fingers paused on a page where Olivia had written, "I'm afraid that I'm not enough. Not enough. For him, for me, for anyone, and I can't fix it. Maybe I don't even want to anymore." His heart clenched, the weight of her vulnerability pressing down on him. This was the woman he loved, broken, unsure, and hiding in plain sight. He met her gaze, his eyes searching hers for the person he thought he knew so well. "Olivia, why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you let me in?" She shook her head, her voice soft but firm. "I didn't know how to ask for help, Ethan. I thought I could fix it on my own, but I couldn't. I was drowning." The confession hit him harder than anything she had said before. It was the raw truth he'd been missing, the truth that had been buried beneath her actions, beneath the lies. She wasn't just cheating. She was struggling with her own demons, too afraid to lean on him, too scared to show him the cracks in her armor. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Ethan sat there, processing the weight of it all. He realized now that it wasn't just about betrayal. It was about isolation. Olivia had been hiding herself from him, not because she didn't love him, but because she didn't know how to ask for help. The thought of what could have been if they had been open with each other from the start filled him with both sorrow and understanding. He wasn't sure if they could ever fully heal, but this revelation felt like a breakthrough. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now, Liv," he said, his voice hoarse. "But I understand. I see you now. And I'm not giving up yet." Olivia nodded, tears streaming down her face. "I don't deserve you, Ethan, but I'll do whatever it takes to make things right, even if it takes forever." Ethan reached out, taking her hand. He wasn't sure where the path ahead would lead. It was a long road, filled with uncertainty, and the damage could never be fully undone. But for the first time in months, he allowed himself a glimmer of hope. Perhaps with time, they could learn to rebuild, not the marriage they had, but a new foundation, one rooted in honesty, vulnerability, and trust. They didn't know what the future would hold. But for now, they were willing to face it together, and maybe, just maybe, that was enough to begin again. Months drifted by like seasons turning, each one a small testament to the fragile but steady progress Ethan and Olivia had made. They weren't the same people they had been before the affair, before the lies, before the disintegration of trust, but maybe that was okay. They weren't trying to be who they once were. They were trying to be something new, something they hadn't fully figured out yet. Every day was a mix of familiarity and discovery, learning how to be vulnerable with each other, how to be honest, how to let go of the past without erasing it completely. Ethan found himself thinking about forgiveness in ways he hadn't expected. It wasn't just about moving past the affair or forgiving Olivia's actions, it was about forgiving himself too. For the times he hadn't seen her struggles, for the moments he had been blind to the cracks forming in their marriage. They had both made mistakes, and healing wasn't just a matter of rebuilding the broken pieces. It was about learning to accept that they were both imperfect people, stumbling through life together. And then came the day Olivia sat down across from him, her face pale, a new kind of uncertainty in her eyes. "I think it's time," she said, her voice quiet but resolute. Ethan put his coffee cup down, the edge of his heart catching. "Time for what?" She took a deep breath, her fingers trembling slightly. "To tell our daughter. To let her know what happened. She's old enough to understand some things, and I don't want to keep this from her anymore." It was a conversation they had both been dreading, knowing that no matter how carefully they approached it, their daughter would feel the weight of their mistakes. But Olivia was right. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about their family, and the truth, however painful, was something they could no longer shelter from her. Ethan looked at Olivia, searching her face for any hint of doubt. He saw none. Only determination and an acceptance that, perhaps for the first time, they were both ready to be fully open with each other and with the world around them. "I'm scared," he confessed quietly, "but I think it's the right thing to do." Olivia nodded. "Me too. But I can't keep pretending that everything's okay when it's not." That evening, after their daughter had finished her homework and they were all gathered around the dinner table, Olivia and Ethan shared the story they had been carrying for so long. They told her the truth, about the affair, about the lies, about the way they had hurt each other, and how they had worked to rebuild their marriage, little by little. They told her that they still loved each other, that they were fighting for their family, and that no matter what had happened, they were a team. Their daughter, to Ethan's surprise, took it better than he had expected. She didn't cry, though there was a quiet sadness in her eyes. She didn't ask many questions, but Ethan could see that she was processing everything in her own way. In the silence that followed, Ethan realized that it wasn't just Olivia who had been carrying the weight of their mistakes. It was their daughter, too. She had witnessed their tension, felt the strain, and though they had tried to protect her from it, she knew more than they had given her credit for. "I don't understand everything," she said softly, looking up from her plate. "But I know you're trying." Ethan reached across the table and squeezed her hand, relief and gratitude flooding him. "We're trying, kiddo. Every day. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless." They had taken another step forward, together, and for the first time in a long time, it felt like they were making progress, not just as a couple, but as a family. The days that followed weren't perfect, but they were real. There were still hard conversations, moments of doubt, and days when the past loomed large. But there were also moments of laughter, shared experiences, and a sense of unity that hadn't been there before. Ethan had come to realize that healing wasn't a destination, it was a continuous process. One that required patience, understanding, and a willingness to embrace the imperfections that came with it. It wasn't easy, but every day they worked at being better for themselves, for each other, and for their daughter. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like the weight of the past had finally begun to lift, leaving room for something new to grow, something stronger, something more honest. And while they didn't know what the future would hold, there was one thing they were certain of. They weren't giving up, not on each other, not on their family, and not on the possibility of finding peace after all the pain. They were writing a new story now, one with scars, yes, but also with hope. As the weeks passed, the dust from their past seemed to settle, but the foundations of their lives had shifted. Ethan and Olivia no longer spoke in the language of what had been lost. They had started to speak in the language of what they were, building. Their daughter, seeing them make these small yet significant strides toward healing, began to open up more about her own feelings, her fears, and her dreams. The honesty between them, once fractured, was now something they all worked to maintain, knowing that it would be their guide through the years ahead. One evening, as they sat on the couch, their daughter tucked in bed for the night, Ethan turned to Olivia with a soft smile. It was the kind of smile that felt like it belonged to a man who had been given another chance, though he knew it wasn't one to be taken for granted. "We're still here," he said quietly, as though speaking to himself as much as to her. Olivia looked up from her phone where she had been scrolling through an old photo album. Her eyes were warm, not with the glimmer of guilt or regret, but with something deeper, something more akin to peace. "Yeah, I think we are." They hadn't just survived the storm. They were learning how to rebuild their lives, brick by brick, with both the love and the scars that came with it. In the quiet moments, they sometimes found themselves simply being together again, no longer chasing the shadows of the past, but making room for the life they had yet to fully rediscover. And yet, even as the distance between them and the past continued to grow, there were moments when the weight of what they had gone through would rear its head. Olivia would catch Ethan's gaze across the room, and for a fleeting moment, there would be a look, a slight tremor, a memory of that other life. He could see it in her eyes, a tinge of sadness, maybe even a bit of guilt that she still carried. It was during one of these moments, late one night, after they had shared a quiet dinner together and their daughter had gone to bed, that Olivia turned to him with a hesitant look. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice low but steady, "about everything, about what I did and why I did it. I know I can't change it, and I know I hurt you more than I can ever explain. But," Ethan met her eyes, watching as her words struggled to take shape, feeling the weight of her hesitation. He placed a hand over hers, offering the kind of support that had taken them so long to develop. Genuine, steady. "You don't have to explain it all," he said gently. "I think we've talked about it enough. The past, it doesn't define us anymore." "We do." Her eyes searched his for a long moment, then softened, as if hearing the finality in his words. But there was something else in that softness, too, a profound understanding that they had crossed some threshold together, one they hadn't even known existed when they were so wrapped up in the chaos of the past. "I know," she whispered, "but I just needed you to hear me say it again. For me, I need to know that you understand how much I regret it. I've thought about it every single day." Ethan's heart tightened, not with anger but with something deeper, something harder to name. Compassion, maybe, or empathy. He couldn't erase what had happened, and perhaps he wasn't supposed to. But he realized, with a deep, aching clarity, that forgiveness wasn't just about erasing the past. It was about choosing to live in the present, together. He nodded slowly, squeezing her hand. "I do understand, and I know you're sorry. We can't undo what's been done, Liv, but we can move forward. And I choose to move forward with you." The words hung in the air, final and true. It wasn't a promise that everything would always be easy, or that they wouldn't face more bumps in the road. But it was a promise that they wouldn't let the past be the end of their story. They would write a new one, together, even if the ink was a little smudged. Days blurred into weeks, and their relationship continued to evolve. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments of uncertainty, quiet moments where the weight of their history pressed in on them. But those moments didn't define them anymore. They had made a choice to stay, to fight, to rebuild. And as the seasons changed, so did their family. Their daughter, though still a young girl, had begun to notice the difference in the way her parents interacted. There was less tension, more laughter, and an openness between them that she hadn't seen before. She still didn't fully understand everything that had happened, but she knew, in the way children do, that her parents were doing the hard work of making things right. One night, after tucking her into bed, Ethan and Olivia stood in the doorway of her room, watching as she drifted off to sleep. There was a quiet satisfaction in the way the room felt, like peace was slowly settling in despite the chaos of the past. The days seemed to stretch out before them, filled with the mundane moments of daily life, the morning coffee, the school runs, the quiet evenings spent curled up on the couch watching movies. But even in these simple moments, Ethan could feel the weight of everything they had endured, the effort that each of them was making to stitch the fabric of their family back together. It wasn't always easy, and there were times when the past would flare up in unexpected ways, like a wound that hadn't fully healed, but they had learned, slowly, to accept the scars. One afternoon, Olivia came to him with something she hadn't shared before. It was a look she carried in her eyes, an uncertainty he hadn't seen in a while. They were sitting together in the kitchen, their daughter at a play date with a friend when she spoke. "Ethan," she began, voice quiet, "there's something I think I should tell you." He looked up from the coffee cup in his hand, instantly alert. It was the kind of tone that made his stomach tighten with unease. "What is it?" he asked, setting the cup down. Olivia paused, her fingers tracing the edge of the countertop. "When Christopher Hale was threatening me, I didn't tell you everything. There was another side to it, a part of it that I didn't want to burden you with." Ethan felt the tension in the air grow, and instinctively, he leaned forward. "What do you mean?" Her eyes flickered with the remnants of something painful, and for a long moment she seemed lost in the weight of it. She took a deep breath before speaking again. "It wasn't just threats to me. He had something on me, something I didn't even realize was happening." Her voice faltered slightly. "I had made some investments, and they weren't legitimate. I didn't know they were fraudulent at the time, but Hale used that to manipulate me, to control me." Ethan's heart pounded, his hands instinctively curling into fists. It wasn't just the affair now, it was the realization that she had, unknowingly or not, put them all at risk. He had to force himself to stay calm, to not lash out. He took a deep breath. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, trying to steady his voice. "I didn't know how," she said softly, the guilt clear in her eyes. "I thought I could fix it, that I could get out of it without anyone knowing. But the more I tried to untangle it, the deeper I got. And then, when Hale found out, he threatened to expose everything. He said I'd lose you, that you'd never forgive me." Ethan stared at her, the gravity of the situation settling in, the weight of the secret she had carried, of the things she had tried to protect him from, suddenly felt as heavy as the entire world. He rubbed his temples, fighting the surge of frustration that threatened to spill over. "You were trying to protect me," he said, but the words didn't have the comfort he hoped they would. There was no easy fix here, no neat way to brush aside the complicated mess that had accumulated between them. "I didn't know how to fix it on my own," Olivia admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have come to you. I should have trusted you more." Ethan stood up, pacing the kitchen in frustration. He wasn't angry at her, not exactly, but the fear, the betrayal, the weight of everything that had happened felt suffocating. His mind raced. If Hale had exploited her, used her vulnerabilities against her, it would have been far more than just an affair. It was manipulation, coercion, and deceit. Olivia had been a pawn, unknowingly, in a game much bigger than their personal pain. Taking a deep breath, Ethan turned back toward her. He needed to stay grounded. He needed to think clearly for the sake of their family. "Olivia, I can't fix this for you," he said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the turmoil inside. "You need to handle this. You need to take responsibility for your part in all of it. But I'm here. I'm not going anywhere. We'll figure this out. Together. She nodded, eyes glistening with the tears she had yet to shed. I'm so sorry, Ethan. I never wanted any of this to happen. He walked over to her, and despite the knot of tension in his chest, pulled her into a hug. It wasn't the kind of embrace where everything was suddenly okay. It wasn't a fix-all, but it was a step toward something more solid, something that, while fragile, had the possibility of being rebuilt. They would take it one step at a time. Over the next few days, Ethan helped Olivia navigate the consequences of her hidden investments. They contacted lawyers, worked with financial experts to untangle the mess, and did what they could to make sure that Christopher Hale couldn't use his knowledge against them anymore. But the process was far from simple. There were calls from investigators, legal threats, and moments where the past felt like it might swallow them whole. And yet, even in those moments, they found themselves holding on to each other with a new understanding. Weeks passed, and the weight of the past never truly left. It lingered in the corners of their home, in the way Ethan sometimes caught himself studying Olivia, looking for signs of deception, of hidden truths. But there was something different now. A quiet resolve, a shared understanding between them that hadn't been there before. It wasn't perfect, but they were in it together. Their daughter, Emily, remained the anchor to which they both clung. She was unaware of the seismic shift that had rocked their family, her laughter echoing through the house like a balm for the raw wounds. Ethan found himself savoring the small moments with her more than ever before. The bedtime stories, the messy breakfast routines, the unspoken bond they shared. She was a reminder of why they had to fight for their family, why they couldn't let the darkness swallow them whole. Still, Ethan couldn't escape the lingering tension. Olivia had made efforts to rebuild trust. No more secrets, no more lies. But the gnawing doubt, the questions that still bubbled beneath the surface, haunted him. He found himself wondering, could he truly forgive her? Could he let go of the bitterness, the sense of betrayal, and let their relationship heal? Or would it always be a scar, a reminder of the trust that had been shattered? One evening, after Emily had gone to bed, Ethan and Olivia sat down in their living room. It was a quiet night, the kind where the world outside felt distant, almost unreachable. Olivia sat on the couch, her posture more open than it had been in months, as if she were laying herself bare for him to examine. I've been thinking about everything, she began, her voice quiet but steady. About us, about what happened. I know I've asked for forgiveness, but I think it's more than that. I don't want to just be forgiven, Ethan. I want to show you that I'm worth trusting again, that I'm not the person I was. Ethan studied her carefully. He saw the sincerity in her eyes, the weight of the guilt she carried. And yet, there was still a hesitation inside him, a part of him that wasn't ready to trust her completely again. He had come so close to losing everything, his family, his life, his sense of self, that the thought of opening himself up fully to her again felt terrifying. I know you're trying, Olivia, he said, his voice hoarse with the emotion he hadn't fully processed. But I'm not sure I can just forget. I don't know if I can ever look at you the same way again. The silence that followed was heavy. Olivia nodded slowly, as though she had been expecting those words, though they clearly stung. I get it, she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't expect you to forget, but I hope in time we can find our way back to something better. I don't want to lose you, Ethan. I don't want to lose us. Ethan swallowed hard. His heart ached with the weight of her words, but there was something else there too, an understanding. He knew that rebuilding wasn't a straight line. It was messy, it was painful, and it would take time. But perhaps there was still something worth saving, even if it was just the fragments of their life together. We'll take it one day at a time, he said, his voice filled with uncertainty but also a quiet determination. I don't know what the future holds. I don't know if things will ever be the way they were, but I'm willing to try. I think we both have a lot of work to do." Olivia nodded again, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "That's all I'm asking for, Ethan. A chance to prove that I'm still the woman you fell in love with." For a moment they sat there in silence, the weight of the past pressing on them but no longer suffocating. The path ahead was unclear, the future uncertain, but there was a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild. It wouldn't be easy, and it wouldn't be perfect, but it could be something worth fighting for. As the days turned into weeks, Ethan and Olivia continued to navigate their new reality. There were still difficult conversations, moments of doubt, and the lingering fear of what might happen if they faltered. But there were also moments of connection, shared glances, small gestures of kindness, moments where they rediscovered the intimacy that had once come so easily. They were no longer the couple they had been, but they were something new, a version of themselves that was stronger for having survived the storm, even if they were still weathered by it. And as they sat on the porch one evening watching the sun dip below the horizon, Ethan realized something. He wasn't sure what the future held or how their story would end, but he knew this. He had made a choice to move forward, to rebuild what had been broken, and to embrace the uncertainty of the path ahead. Because in the end, that was all anyone could do, keep moving forward one step at a time. The days began to blend together, each one a mix of small victories and lingering doubts. Ethan had always believed that time healed all wounds, but he had learned that wasn't quite true. Sometimes, time just allowed the pain to settle in too, the background, where it simmered, waiting for the right moment to surface again. There were nights when Olivia would catch him looking at her, and he could see the question in her eyes. "Do you still love me?" It was a question she hadn't voiced aloud, but it hung between them, heavy and unspoken. And sometimes, Ethan couldn't answer it. He wasn't sure if love, the kind they had once had, could return after all that had happened. But there was something else now, something that felt like it could be the beginning of something new, a bond forged in the aftermath of betrayal. They had started going to therapy together. The sessions were difficult, raw, but they had become a place where both of them could voice what they'd been holding inside. The therapist didn't have any magical answers, but the process gave them a space to confront the wounds they hadn't even known were there. One session, the therapist asked Olivia why she had kept the affair a secret for so long. Olivia had paused, looking at Ethan before speaking. "I didn't think I deserved to be loved anymore," she admitted, her voice shaking. "I thought if I told you, you'd leave. I thought it was better if I tried to fix it myself, but I was only digging myself deeper." The truth of her words hit Ethan harder than he expected. He had been so focused on the betrayal itself that he hadn't stopped to ask why. Why she had done what she did. Why she hadn't come to him when she was struggling. She had been living in a prison of her own making, and he had been blind to it, thinking only of his own hurt. It made him think, too, of the times when he hadn't been present enough. The long hours at work, the quiet silences at home, the distance that had grown between them long before Christopher Hale had entered their lives. He had failed, too, not in the same way, but in his own way. After that session, things between them shifted again. They weren't perfect, not by any stretch, but they started communicating more openly, even when the truth was uncomfortable. They began to rebuild not just trust, but understanding, a deeper kind of connection that had been lacking for years. The months that followed brought moments of genuine growth. They took small steps, date nights, conversations about their hopes and fears, rebuilding the intimacy that had once been so natural. They had learned that healing wasn't linear. There were days when Ethan felt the weight of the betrayal so strongly that it threatened to pull him under. But there were also days when he looked at Olivia and saw something more than the woman who had betrayed him. He saw the woman who was trying, who was fighting to earn back what they had lost. And in those moments he remembered why he had fallen in love with her in the first place. Not because she was perfect, but because she was real, flawed, human, and capable of growth, just like him. But even as they moved forward, Ethan knew there were still unanswered questions. What if things fell apart again? What if Olivia made another mistake? What if, despite everything, he couldn't fully trust her again? The uncertainty of it all weighed heavily on him, but there was something else, a quiet hope that, for all the pain they'd been through, they were still in this together. And that, in itself, was enough to keep trying. One evening, after a long day, Olivia sat beside him on the couch, her head resting on his shoulder. He could feel the warmth of her presence, the way she had begun to lean into him again, seeking comfort in the same way they once had. "Do you think we can make it, Ethan?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He glanced down at her, taking in the vulnerability in her eyes, the uncertainty that mirrored his own. He reached over and gently brushed a lock of hair from her face, his heart still unsure, but his resolve strengthening. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I want to try. I think that's all we can do." She nodded, her hand resting over his. "I'll keep trying, too." And for the first time in a long while, Ethan felt something he hadn't in months, a flicker of hope. It wasn't a guarantee, and it wasn't an easy road, but it was something, a chance to rebuild, piece by fragile piece, one day at a time. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months. Ethan and Olivia's new life was built on the shaky foundation of what had come before, the pain, the betrayal, the lies. But it was also built on something more, something they hadn't seen before in each other: resilience. Neither of them had walked away, even when they had every reason to. That, in itself, was a testament to something deeper, something worth saving. Their daughter, Emma, remained their steady anchor. Her innocence, her laughter, her need for them, together, was a constant reminder of what they had to lose. Every time Ethan saw Olivia playing with Emma, he remembered why he had married her in the first place. It wasn't just about love. It was about shared history, a future together, and a life that, despite the cracks, could still be beautiful. The therapy sessions continued, though their intensity began to fade as they reached a place of more honest communication. Olivia had gone to the police about Christopher Hale's scams, helping bring down a network of criminals. Her role in it, albeit unwitting at first, had placed a strain on their finances as well. It wasn't a simple recovery, both emotionally and practically, but they were managing, one step at a time. Ethan had taken on a side project, something he could pour his energy into that wasn't about what had happened, but what was happening now. He started writing again, something he had put aside for years. His journal entries became cathartic, a way to channel the turbulent emotions he had been holding inside. Some nights he wrote about Olivia, about the love they had lost and the love they were fighting to find again. Other nights he wrote about himself, the man he was becoming in the aftermath, the person who had been shaken to his core and was slowly putting himself back together. One night, after Emma had gone to bed, Olivia sat down beside him. She reached for his hand, her fingers tentative but warm. "I've been thinking," she said, her voice soft, "about us, about everything. I don't want to just go through the motions anymore. I want to be more than just the woman who betrayed you. I want to be the woman you can count on." Ethan looked at her, the weight of her words settling deep inside him. He could see the sincerity in her eyes, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something stronger than just forgiveness. He didn't need her to be perfect. He didn't need her to fix everything. But he needed to know she was willing to try. And that, in itself, felt like a new beginning. "I'm still figuring out what I need," he said, his voice barely above. A whisper. "But I'll let you know when I'm ready." Olivia nodded, her eyes welling with emotion. She didn't try to push him, didn't try to rush the healing process. They both knew that the road ahead would not be easy, that it would take time, patience, and a lot of work. But they had both learned that even the hardest paths could lead to something worth walking. As they sat there in the stillness of the evening, Ethan thought about the choices they had both made, the choices to hurt, to forgive, to rebuild, and, though he didn't know what the future would bring, he was beginning to believe that they could find their way, together or apart, one step at a time, and for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel so lost. Months passed, and the rhythm of their days grew steadier, though still filled with the occasional ripple of uncertainty. Olivia had proven herself in more ways than one. Her commitment to change, her willingness to face the past, and her determination to be the woman Ethan needed. It was not perfect, not without moments of doubt, but it was something real. They had made progress, but it wasn't always linear. There were nights when the memories of the affair resurfaced, when the trust was still fragile, and Ethan felt the sting of betrayal creeping into his thoughts. But there were also moments of tenderness, small acts of love, glances across a crowded room that reminded him of the connection they once had. It was a slow kind of healing, the kind that didn't announce itself with grand gestures or sudden changes. It was in the little things. The way Ethan would kiss Olivia's forehead before leaving for work, a gesture that had once felt too trivial to matter. The way Olivia would hold his hand a little longer when they walked through the grocery store, a silent reminder that she was there, that she was fighting for them. Emma, their daughter, had adapted well, though she could sense the tension between them. At times, Ethan wondered if she understood more than he gave her credit for. She'd started asking questions about their relationship, questions that weren't always easy to answer. One night, after tucking her into bed, Ethan found himself sitting with Olivia in the living room, the silence between them comfortable yet heavy. "Do you think Emma's starting to understand what happened?" Olivia asked, her voice low. Ethan didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a deep breath and glanced out the window, watching the last remnants of daylight fade into the horizon. "I don't know. I think she knows something's not quite right. But I think she feels safe with us. I think that's what matters." Olivia nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "I'm scared she'll get hurt." "You're not the only one," Ethan said, his tone soft but firm. "But we're doing our best, Liv. We can't change what happened, but we can show her that love is more than just the mistakes we make. It's about how we deal with them." There was a long pause. Then Olivia reached over, taking his hand in hers. "I'm sorry, Ethan, for everything. I don't think I can say it enough." He squeezed her hand, feeling the weight of her apology, but more than that, feeling her presence. It was the quiet understanding between them that had begun to mean more than the words ever could. "I know. I know." Their life had not returned to what it once was, but perhaps that was okay. They were learning that relationships didn't need to be perfect to be worth fighting for. One evening, as they sat down for dinner together, Emma excitedly shared the story of her day. The sound of her laughter filled the room, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Ethan felt the familiar warmth of his family around him. He looked at Olivia, and for the first time in a long while, he saw her. Not as the woman who had betrayed him, but as the woman who had fought to rebuild their life, who had fought for their family. And in that moment, Ethan realized something important. Forgiveness wasn't a destination. It wasn't a moment where everything was healed and forgotten. It was a journey they were walking together step by step. It wasn't clear yet where that journey would lead, but as long as they continued walking it together, he knew there was hope. And sometimes, that's all you really need. As the weeks turned into months, Ethan found himself at a crossroads. The weight of the past was still there, a constant undercurrent in his thoughts, but the present felt different. It felt like a new kind of normal. The fragile trust he and Olivia had rebuilt was no longer a brittle thing that might shatter with the slightest tremor. It had become something firmer, though still vulnerable, like a flower growing in the cracks of a broken sidewalk, something that had endured, something that was learning to thrive despite the circumstances. Emma's laughter continued to echo through their home, her innocence a reminder of what they were fighting for. But as much as they tried to shield her from the complexities of their adult world, she was growing older, and with it, her questions became sharper, more probing. She had started asking about her father's and mother's relationship, about what happened to the smiles that used to be more frequent, about the tension that sometimes lingered in the air when they thought she wasn't looking. One afternoon, as Ethan watched Olivia interact with Emma in the backyard, he realized how much they had all changed. Olivia, once distant and wrapped in her own web of guilt and lies, now exuded a quiet strength, a strength that was rooted in her vulnerability. Ethan, too, had changed. He wasn't the man who had lived in the comfort of certainty and routine anymore. He had been shaken, tested, but in some strange way, he had also grown. He had learned to be more aware of the nuances of their life, of the subtle signals Olivia sent, of the way his own heart still longed for her, even when it was wrapped in fear. It wasn't perfect, but then again, who was? Olivia sat down beside him, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. Her eyes, once clouded with guilt, now looked steady, more at peace with herself. "Do you ever think about where we go from here?" she asked quietly, her voice soft but tinged with uncertainty. Ethan glanced at her, studying her face, the same face he had once fallen in love with, the face that had held so much pain. He had asked himself that question many times. Could they really move forward? Could they build something new from the wreckage of the past? Was there even a chance for them to be truly happy again? He let out a long breath. "I think about it a lot. I think about it every day." "Are you afraid?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. He hesitated. Was he afraid? He couldn't deny the fear that still lingered, the fear of falling into old patterns, the fear of trusting too much only to be hurt again. But there was something else, something stronger. "Yeah, I'm afraid. But I'm also willing to try. For us." Her hand found his, warm and familiar. "I don't want to be afraid anymore," she said, her voice a quiet resolve. "I want to be the woman I promised I would be for you, for Emma. I don't want to be defined by my mistakes." Ethan nodded, squeezing her hand gently. He had no grand answers, no perfect solution. But he did know one thing. They were still here. And sometimes that was enough. In the months that followed, they continued to build piece by piece, taking each day as it came. Ethan didn't know if they would ever fully heal from the scars left by Olivia's betrayal, but they were learning to navigate those scars, to understand that they didn't have to define their future. They had learned that love was not just the big moments, the grand gestures. It was the quiet moments, the willingness to show up, even when it was hard. And for the first time in a long time, Ethan didn't feel like he was carrying the weight of the world on his shoulders. Instead, he felt lighter, freer, free from the chains of resentment and doubt, free to move forward, even if that forward was uncertain. As they sat around the dinner table that evening, their daughter's chatter filling the space with warmth, Ethan looked at Olivia. The years that had come before seemed both distant and painfully close. But in that moment, they were simply two people, still in the process of healing, still learning, still hoping. He didn't have all the answers, but maybe that was okay. Maybe life didn't have to have all the answers. Maybe it was enough to simply keep moving forward. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden glow over their little home, Ethan thought maybe, just maybe, there was a future for them after all. A future that didn't erase the past, but embraced it. A future they could build together, one imperfect step at a time.